Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for tuning in to today's webcast. My name is Zina Pagan, ARS Marketing Manager and your moderator for today. Before we begin learning about the top drivers that consistently improve brand preference and therefore financial performance over time, I'll review our house rules. We are aiming to provide the best webcast experience possible. You can help us execute this by keeping yourself muted and your computer web camera turned off. The audio will be streamed. This means that you will be able to hear us through your computer speakers. However, if you prefer to use the teleconference option, please use the information provided on your screen. Additionally, I will post the information on the chat box throughout the webcast. Should you have any questions during the session, please send these to me using the chat box. ARS does not own the rights to the presentation. However, the session will be recorded. If you would like to view the recorded event, the file will be available within 2 weeks from today. We are extending the conversation on social media. If you'd like to join us, please use the hashtag #ARFWebcast. You can also find this information on the top left corner of the deck in front of you. If you're interested in hosting a webcast, please contact me at zina@thears.org. Next slide, please. We do have a few events coming up. Through tomorrow, March 9th, ARF is hosting our winter session of the ARF Leadership Lab. This semester will give you the tools to make the complicated world of ad tech more simple. Our next webcast will be held on April 5th with Facebook. This webcast will help you to make advertisers celebrate personal milestones on mobile. And last but not least, next slide, please. I do invite you all to join Ad Age's Executive of the Year, Wendy Clark, Peacemaker Jose Miguel Sokolov, Gymnastics Champion turned CMO Jen Fay, and Financial Marketing Guru Raja Manar at our annual conference on March 20th to the 21st. Also at our annual conference, you'll have an opportunity to meet our new CEO, Scott McDonald. If you're interested in any of these events or other ARF programs, you can visit our website for further details or contact me at dina@thears.org. And without further delay, I present to you today's webcast, Establishing Drivers of Performance and Choice with Frank Findley. Frank is the Executive Vice President of Research for MSW.ARS Research. His work has resulted in improvements to the copy test, tracking, media, and competitive intelligence product line. He was co-inventor of the patented Outlook Media Planner and designed the industry's first multi-touchpoint holistic campaign testing system. His more recent work has focused on panel quality, the sales effectiveness of digital advertising, and transitioning behavioral measurement systems online. Frank co-leads the Brand Investment and Valuation Project team for MASB, the Marketing Accountability Standards Board. Frank, the webcast is yours. Take it away.
Well, thank you for that kind introduction. Hello, everyone. Today we have a unique and hopefully interesting presentation for you. It's unique in that it covers a wide variety of topics, and interesting because it deals with one of the biggest issues we face as an industry. That issue is that we work in paradoxical times. Brands have grown to be among the largest assets a company owns, yet this is not always recognized because they regularly don't appear on the balance sheet. This puts marketing and finance teams at a disadvantage in assessing brand investments, and it also has an impact in that it makes it difficult for brands to uncover drivers for consistent growth. And I think this chart summarizes pretty well, or this picture summarizes pretty well, what often happens within companies, unfortunately. To bridge this gap, MASB, the Marketing Accountability Standards Board, sponsored an ambitious project called the Brand Investment and Valuation Project, and it has been conducted in 2 phases. Phase 1 was to establish missing linkages between marketing and financial metrics and build a brand investment and valuation model that any brand could use. So literally, this model can be applied within a company for their brands to be able to value a brand and track that valuation over time. Now, early on when this project was started, there was a realization that we really, as an industry, didn't need more metrics. What we actually needed was to understand the linkages between those metrics. We had consumer metrics, which included things like awareness, purchase intent, and, of course, brand preference, which we'll talk about a little bit more here in a second. We had market metrics like market share, price versus the competition, and percent ACV, if you're a packaged goods company, so distribution. And then we also had the financial metrics internal to the organization, things which included velocity, cash flow, items like that. And so the question or the idea was to bring together a group of people who could look across, who were experts in all those metrics and could look across them. These experts included leading academics from top schools, specialists from research companies. This is how I actually became involved in the MASB project for MSW.ARS representative, and finance and marketing practitioners from 6 blue chip corporations. And these are those participants. And one thing about the participants is that it wasn't just insights, but it was actually a broad group of people from these participants, specifically marketing practitioners and their finance counterparts. So we had people both on the marketing side and the finance side, as well as involvement from the insights groups. Together, this group created the brand investment and valuation model, which I show here. And we're going to go into more detail on how we arrived at this point. But I thought I'd take you through it so you can understand where we ended up on our thinking. So the model works here in the bottom corner called brand activities, where brands do various things to promote themselves. The wide variety, when we talk about this, we mean the wide variety, not just communications, but the wide variety of brand activities. Those activities then create a strength in the consumer's mind, in their customer's mind. So we'll call that customer brand strength. And we're going to talk about a metric that we found that acts as a cornerstone metric that basically captures the effect of all these different brand activities and rolls them up. So you have customer brand strength. That customer brand strength has an interaction with both distribution and price. But most importantly, when distribution, price, and customer brand strength come together, it actually determines market share, the part of the market that's actually controlled by that brand. That market share, when brought together with category volume, leads to a velocity. And in this term, we're not talking about velocity in the marketing sense, but velocity in the actual financial sense, cash velocity. Along with that, price also influences margin. That is the amount that each individual unit sold contributes to the company after cost. And together, those two things determine the operating cash flow. That operating cash flow currently and then going into the future can actually be summed up and discounted using a present value calculation, where that discounting takes into account the volatility and the risk of those investments. And then ultimately, that leads us to, with that present value calculation, a brand value, an actual financial value for that brand. So as you can see by these dark lines, the arrows which are darkened, these have all been empirically demonstrated through this BIV Phase 1 project. How that was done was through a 1.5-year tracking. So these 6 participants each chose 2 categories, and for those 2 categories had all the brands in those categories tracked in terms of their brand preference or choice, as well as other marketing variables like awareness, things, purchase intent, advocacy, other common marketing variables. So the brand preference which was used in these trials was provided by MSW.ARS, and it used an incentivized methodology where consumers chose the product they truly wanted from a competitive set. And the way this was done was through a prize drawing. That allowed everything else in the buying experience, price, promotion, shelf position, to be held constant or to be separated from that indication of brand preference. Sorry for the brief delay on the slide transition. So for a year and a half, this presentation or this tracking project went forward, and brand preference was gathered for over 120 individual brands. So on this chart on the left-hand side, each dot represents an individual brand, and it represents their brand preference on the x-axis, and on the y-axis is actually their unit share. So what that brand actually got in units out of the category. And as you can see, there was quite a strong correlation of 0.88 that was gathered from that brand preference to unit share. And this relationship was consistently strong. In fact, it showed stronger relationships within each of the individual categories, which are the 12 boxes on the right hand of the slide. But even more compelling with that was when this brand preference was combined with price premium and distribution, and those were multiplied together. In that case, when taking into account price and distribution, the relationship moved from a correlation of 0.88 to 0.94, or said another way, 89% of the differences in share that were exhibited among the brands across categories were captured by this. Now, why price and distribution? Well, price has an effect in that people, while they prefer a brand, they may choose an alternative to buy down, if you will, to save money. And for distribution, it has to do with findability. If they can't find the particular product at the retailer which they're shopping, then they are less inclined to actually buy it. They're less able to buy it. So bringing these together, we find a very strong relationship for understanding how consumer metrics interact with those marketplace metrics. Now, we talked about other marketing metrics, for example, awareness, brand loyalty, value, purchase intent, brand relevance, and advocacy. There were also actually 70 of these other elements which were included in the project, where we looked at the relationship of those elements to unit share along with the relationship to brand preference. Now, one thing to note is that these that are shown on this slide were the most common. These elements were generally tracked within the brand's equity tracking systems for all the different participants for their category. And what you'll see is that they do indeed show all these relationships were significant and they were all sizable to unit share, but none of them rose to the level of preference. Preference actually explained more variation in unit share than any of the others. The same thing is when you look at brand preference, you'll see that there is a strong relationship for all these other metrics to brand preference. And that the difference between those relationships, for example, awareness unaided, 52% versus 48% for unit share, is the ratio of the difference in that you saw in the previous chart of unexplained variance. So in short, this strongly implied that brand preference was collecting the impacts of these other metrics and then translating that through to unit share. Said another way, if you improve brand relevance, if people feel that the brand fits their lifestyles and needs better, that will lead to them having a higher brand preference and choosing your brand, which will lead to a higher position for your brand and market share. Now on the financial side, for those internal valuation, how did that play out? Is there validation for this model on that side? Well, we're going to show you in this slide one case study. This comes from one brand, and each of these bars and dots represents a brand within that company. So this is a company that has multiple brands. And what they did is they used the BIV model approach to create a brand valuation, which is given by the orange dot, the gold dot. And they also looked at the long-term marketing spend that they had placed behind each of these individual brands. And as would be expected, they found a very strong trend. The brands that have been supported over time by marketing spend yielded a stronger brand valuation, and the ones which were less supported had lower brand valuation. In fact, there was one that was actually removed from market. But you can also see that the relationship is slightly different from each other in that some brands actually had a much higher impact from the marketing spend than others. They were more efficient at being driven. And while other ones were had the opposite effect. So what this says is that each brand has its own experiences, and that has to do with the ability of marketing to actually drive the performance of that brand. These learnings were then compiled to make them readily available into a book. They were included in the book Accountable Marketing, which you can get from Amazon. I highly recommend the Kindle edition or electronic edition so that you can actually search over the different chapters. It includes all the findings from the VIV Phase 1 project, as well as numerous other articles that on the topic of brand valuation. And then another thing is that there was a question of would this metric be readily available, just broadly available to the public. So MSW actually picked up the mantle there, and they created what's called the Brand Strength Monitor, which is that brand preference tracking metric for all the brands in the category, tracked continuously, monthly, at high sample size rates. And this is provided, the data is then provided back through an online dashboard, which can actually integrate into financial reporting systems. And it's also an affordable solution. What they did is they implemented it as the same as a share data, where it's a syndicated service. So it comes in at about 10% the cost of traditional trackers because you're actually sharing the cost with other categories. So that was phase 1 of the project, and the results of phase 1 were actually presented at the ARP Rethink in 2016. But shortly after the project phase completed, another question arose. The participants were very able now to create brand value. They were very able to calculate a brand value and track it over time. And they were able to connect the customer brand strength and their other metrics through that process. So the linkages were established. But then the question came up, well, what about this box in red, these brand activities leading to greater customer brand strength? Is there a way to identify the best drivers of this customer brand strength so that you could continuously grow the brand value over time? So that question was actually summarized in an email by one of the participants like this. What marketing/advertising drivers can be identified to continuously improve consumer brand preference and thus improve financial impact and ultimately brand values? Now note, drivers in this sense refers to actions or decisions the brand and finance teams can implement that will have a statistically significant and business relevant effect on financial performance. Well, the team decided to launch another phase of the project, which aptly enough was named Phase 2, a game changer, with the issue being that now that we knew how to take it from brand preference to brand value, how can we increase it? What guidance or guidelines can be provided to marketers to continuously improve their brand preference and thus their brand valuations? So this project, the strategy was to find these drivers to continuously improve the consumer brand value metric. And the idea behind this is to come up with principles, to come up with those drivers, but put it in a sense that is leverageable by the brand marketers. So this project was launched back in September 2015. In February 2016 was an initial review of all the documents available, the research literature, if you will, to identify and find out what is known from a variety of different marketing perspectives. While we were doing this, we were actually presenting the results of Phase 1 at various industry webcasts and conferences and getting more feedback. And where we ended up with was by September 2016 was 10 principles identified. Based on more feedback, this then went to 16 principles by February 2017, and we continue to gather more of them. So here we are today, and what we'd like to do is take you through the first 16 principles which were identified. Now, why do we call these principles, and why are we so, dedicated to proven principles as opposed to unfounded generalizations? Well, that comes from the quality movement. Early on the quality movement, there was an idea that people have their best efforts, and they will always put their best efforts forward. But unless there are guidelines to those efforts, that can run astray. So these guidelines in the quality movement were called principles. And so whenever you look at standards, you'll see under those standards, you will see principles. So we adopted the same language. As the father of quality movement, Deming said, best efforts are essential. Unfortunately, best efforts, people charging this way and that way without guidance or principles, can do a lot of damage. And then remember when on the proven side, that we wanted to make sure that the brand teams and the marketing teams had the data where they could go back and get that seat at the table. And so Deming has a very colorful quotation regarding that. So where did these brand principles come from? Well, they come from meta-analyses, large data sets, oftentimes in the excess of 10,000 cases, individual cases, that these meta-analyses have been compiled together into tertiary and secondary research. There are 3 general publications that we found most of the principles come from. In fact, all of the principles can be found documented in one of these 3 presentations. One of them came from the Marketing Accountability Standards Board itself, and it provided a detailed review of proven practices for driving television ROI, though many of the findings are applicable to other channels besides just television. Another comes from Empirical Generalizations about Marketing Impact from Dr. Hansen's, and this is published by the MSI. And in the current version of it includes 123 evidence-based findings on the impact of multiple types of marketing activities. And then concurrent with phase 1, in the ARP itself produced a set of works of how advertising works today, which was a recent industry collaboration on yielding new media ground truths. So that brings in a lot more of the digital learnings, the newer media learnings. So collectively between these, we were able to look at all the different types of grounding and come up with these principles. Another advantage of this that we had within MASB were that many of these findings, the actual authors of the original studies were active within MASB, so we could actually draw upon them to even provide more data and the subsequent data sources. So let's go through the 16 principles. Now this is a very short webcast, and 16 principles are a lot to go through. So what we're going to do is we're going to state the principles and also the practice implication. That is, what is the action that the brand could take based upon that principle. Then we're going to provide some of the data backing up these individual principles, but of course not all of it, because many of these principles have a dozen studies supporting them. So what we tried to do is take the best one that illustrates the point forward so that we could more quickly get an understanding of the learning. Okay, so number 1 is that TV activity explains 65% of the variation in market share changes quarter to quarter. In a meta-analysis, one of the key findings was that when marketers do television advertising, that when you look at the quarter-to-quarter changes in market share, 65% of them, or 2/3 of them, are actually driven by that television advertising. So television is still a very powerful medium, and the practice implication from that is it is a medium to be used. So that different advertisers shouldn't shy away or move away from television, but should actually still actively use it. Another finding from these type of meta-analysis was that a variation in the strength of the TV ads that aired explains 52% of the variation in market share. In other words, it is the strength of the ads themselves rather than how they're actually flighted. But the strength of the ads themselves explains half of the movement that is seen in this share. So the practice implication from that is improve the ads. The stronger the ads, the better the outcome in market. And here's a pie chart that basically just summarizes this learning. You can see the 65% of the variance explained by television, different forms of television. And then you can see that the part that comes from the TV ads themselves. This strength metric that was used in this meta-analysis was actually APM fact, which is a form of shift in brand preference after being exposed to a single quality exposure. So it really gets down to the effect of the ad itself, rather than how it's implemented in market. The next two principles also have to do with television specifically, but then also are generalizable. Principle number 3 is that it is no longer a matter of whether or not TV advertising is effective, but whether it is effective enough to meet the specific business objectives at hand. One of the points of the quality movement was to actually set up hurdles, if you will, or less than hurdles, they're more actual business objectives. There are things to strive for and things to make sure are met. And what this principle suggests is that the same thing should be done with an advertising plan, as part of the advertising plan, there should be financial business objectives tied to that. The second, principle number 4 here, the second principle on this page, is that when there are indications that the advertising plan will not meet the business objectives, just a couple points improvement will often make the difference. What this goes at is that the strength of the ads, you saw how important the strength of those ads are. So if in market, when an ad first airs or a campaign launches, if it doesn't seem to be meeting the business objectives, just making some improvements to that ad can actually oftentimes bring about a positive ROI. Here's an example from meta-analysis. Again, this uses a change in brand preference of an individual ad with a quality exposure to group the different performances in market. So you can see just a small change of moving from, say, a 5 change in brand preference up to a 7 or 8 brand preference can move the average share change in market seen from a 0.8 to a 1.6, almost doubling it. Another part of this is that the probability of actually achieving a given share change. As the chart on the right shows, there is a probability associated with meeting, just maintaining share, and then a half share point, a 1 share point gain, and a 2 share point gain. And as you can see, that stronger ads actually increase the probability of meeting those different share levels, or share change levels, actually. So John Philip Jones actually investigated this data set in depth, and he came to the conclusion based upon it that it's possible to identify sales-effective advertising before airing if the proper measurement tools are used. In this term, the proper measurement tools is that APM FACS measure, which is a change in brand preference. Principles 5 and 6 have to go with moving earlier in the process. So the question is, okay, it's fine to improve ads later in the process as they go to air, but could that be done earlier in the process? And the answer is yes, in a couple of different ways. One way is executing your advertising from a superior proposition, because superior propositions result in superior final advertising. A corollary to this, which was actually seen in the ARP study, was that the use of a consistent value proposition across media platforms leads to stronger lifts in brand health metrics. So it's not just about, this isn't just about an individual ad. This is about finding a proposition, that big idea, that will feed into advertising across the different media platforms. And here's another example of a study showing this effect. On the y-axis, we have the value proposition stage, which is the ability of an ad to generate a change in brand preference at different benchmark levels, so at its benchmark, below its benchmark, and above its benchmark. And then on the x-axis, we have the brand preference change versus that benchmark for the finished execution stage. And what you can see is that if you have a weak proposition, a below benchmark proposition, 67% of the time the advertising based on that proposition will be below. And 33% of the time it is possible to move it into the middle group ad with strong creative approach. But on the other side, if you start with an above average proposition, 69% of the time the advertising based on that proposition will be above average. Now, the question comes up is what is meant by proposition? Oftentimes people view it as proposition being rational statements, but that's not true at all. Some of the strongest propositions that have been found have actually been emotional propositions that come from an emotional insight. And so what I'd like to do is share one. We looked through the ARP David Ogilvy Award case studies, and we found an example of an ad based upon a proposition that was emotional. It is from Lay's chips, and what they found was that there is a strong emotional motion of anticipation when opening a bag of Lay's chips. When they tested that proposition in its rough stage as a proposition, it performed at multiples to benchmark levels, and the finished copy exceeded those results. In the marketing, this campaign produced some of the highest incremental sales the brand has seen, and of course it won numerous awards. So here is this ad. So we can see that that moment of anticipation, that emotional messaging, comes through very strongly and proved itself in the market. This is actually from the ARP study. And by the way, each of these have their individual sources underneath, so you can actually go one layer deeper than the tertiary research we cited. And this shows the effect of that non-unified versus that unified campaigns. So what happens when you have a unified campaign where the proposition goes across all the media platforms versus one which is more disjointed? Now, David Ogilvy actually was a very strong proponent of this. This is a quote from one of the videos that he actually produced for the ARS that's in the archives. In my experience, the most valuable use of research is the creative process in testing promises, which was his term for propositions. If your promise is strong, your advertising will sell. If your promise is feeble, your advertising won't sell. Okay, number 6 and number 7. What other approaches can be taken early on to improve these propositions and also the finished advertising? Well, there are a handful of strategic elements that have been found to be present in stronger ads, and also a few executional elements that have been found to be present in stronger ads. And what's interesting about this is that these elements are regularly used by creative agencies within their creation of their ads. They are extremely popular approaches. I shouldn't say approaches because they're really more content that the agencies use to hang their approaches on to make their creative communicate. And so on the left-hand side are these strategic approaches. One is a brand differentiating key message. Another is new product, new feature information, product convenience, competitive comparison, superiority claim, and a brand name reinforces benefit. The number represents the percent of ads from collective database of 30,000 ads that these were actually drawn from. So 46% of those ads, the creative agencies used a brand differentiating key message, included a brand differentiating key message. 47% they concentrated on innovation, new product, new feature information. From an execution standpoint, it really comes down to the prominence of the brand within the ads, using a setting directly related to use, actual product on screen, brand name mentions, brand name logo on screen, category identification, product package shown, and demonstration of product in use. Agencies use these very regularly to tie the creative to the brand. All of these elements that are shown here have been empirically proven to be associated with stronger advertising. Now again, there's sometimes a misconception regarding this that these are elements that, this creates formulaic advertising. But the truth is that there is no formula for advertising, and it's almost impossible to include all of these elements in a single ad. The ad would become disjointed, and it would actually work to cross purposes. So really, it's about the clever use of these and the approaches that the creative agency employs. And so what I'd like to do is give a demonstration from Apple of two different ways that they approach the brand differentiation aspect. One was in a famous ad from 1984, which aired only once during the Super Bowl, and it was the launch copy for Apple Mac, the Macintosh. Then in 2006 was another relaunch campaign, again to do brand differentiation of the Mac versus a standard PC. And this was done in 2006. Instead of a Super Bowl, this campaign was meant to be very digital friendly and implemented through digital channels. So let's look at these two different approaches to brand differentiation. As you can see from those two ads, that they are radically different in the creative approach taken, but both successfully differentiate the Macintosh from PCs. The 1984 ad was extremely dark-toned, a very serious approach to evoke emotions accordingly, whereas the 2006 campaign, which it implemented through a whole host of different versions of the ad, was very light and airy, fun, humorous. So again, two different approaches, two different ways of using brand differentiation. So Dave Stewart made this point clear that from these research studies, there is no magic formula for the creation of effective advertising. While some general guidelines for effective advertising appear to receive support from the finding, it is also true that no one executional factor accounts for much of the total variance. The single most important factor identified was the presence of a brand differentiating message. Okay. Now let's turn to number 8, 9, and 10. This has to do with the actual execution or flighting of the advertising in market. One observation was that an ad's selling power works quickly and predictably with diminishing returns and wears out in the process. The number 9 is each execution, even within a campaign, has its own unique brand preference building power value. And by execution, that means individual ad, not campaign. So a campaign will include multiple ads. And then finally, that continuous airing produces more sales than flighting with similar weight. So here you see on this chart, you can actually see this orange line, which is a wear out chart. What that is the brand preference reducing as an ad goes to air. So you can take an ad and you can actually test it multiple times, pre-test, post-test, multiple times, and capture its value. And what has been discovered is that as GRPs are placed behind that ad, it will wear down. It will be less and less able to produce a change in brand preference, and that this change, this wear out, in brand preference will also lead to a diminishing return in the amount of share change that can be driven by that ad, which is shown by these green bars. So if you look at the right-hand column, you can see you have an ad that produces a brand preference effect. It will air, and share will move up and then wear down. Another ad can come on air. This time it's a stronger ad, a 10, in terms of brand preference. The share will move up, and then it will wear down. Again, you can add another ad. Share will move up and move down. Air, refresh, air, refresh. So what this suggests is that brands would be good to make sure that they have the number of executions of a campaign necessary to avoid wear out, so that there's always fresh copy on air, whether it's done sequentially or concurrently. There's always fresh copy to continue to drive this share effect. This has been confirmed through numerous MMM studies as well. So when you look at market mix modeling data, like in this particular case, you can see that the first 1,000 GRPs produced a much stronger volume per GRP than the remaining GRPs in the campaign. And then there's the concept of flighting, where flighting is, should you do continuous airing of an ad, have a continuous presence in the marketplace, or should you concentrate it in waves? And the research pretty much shows that except for lower level of GRPs, you should strive for a continuous presence. That continuous campaigns tend to outperform flighted campaigns, except in the case where low GRPs. Why in the case of low GRPs? Well, you can see this meta-analysis of almost 8,000 cases from market mix modeling that shows the effective frequency effect, which is that for certain campaigns, a percentage of campaigns need more frequencies to have their message communicated than other campaigns. Most campaigns, within 1, 2, or 3 frequencies of a consumer seeing it, the message is communicated. But in other advertising, it can take more. And so to be able to get to make sure to have the appropriate number of frequencies, if you have a low GRP campaign, then you may have to flight. But in the vast majority of cases, continuous is stronger. Meg Blair quotes it this way: while never perfect, the knowledge, measurement, and models are available to account for advertising's impact after the fact and to forecast the expected contribution of the plan for the next business quarter before going to air and with time to adjust the plan. Principles 11 and 12. Advertising across platforms, especially TV and digital, delivers larger changes in brand preference and reach, resulting in higher ROI. And number 12 is word of mouth, including e-word of mouth, has a measurable impact on sales and brand preference. Often impact from negative word of mouth is larger than from positive. Okay, so here's another part of that ARP analysis that you'll see. And what this is the incremental ROI of additional platforms. So whether you have 1 platform, 2 platforms, 3 platforms, the more platforms you use, the more incremental ROI that you receive. When you move from 1 platform to 2 platforms, you actually see a 19% increase in ROI, incremental ROI. And from going forward to 3, that number is 23%, and so on and so forth. So it's best to actually implement your campaigns across multiple platforms. As far as word of mouth, there is this is one of the ones which is probably the least explored right now in the literature, but there are some really good case studies. And what they show is that word of mouth, especially word of mouth, blogs, forums, social networks, and sites, do actually have a positive volume elasticity, where volume elasticity means for a percentage change in the amount of word of mouth talked about, that your brand is talked about, a corresponding change in the volume that that brand has in market. On average, that elasticity is a 0.236, but there are some circumstances in which it's much, much stronger. For example, in durable goods category, where products are purchased less frequently. Private consumed goods, low triability product for less competitive industries, and then also for reviews carried on independent sites. So having your social content on independent sites actually is a very strong approach. 13 and 14. Now we're getting into other aspects of the marketing toolbox. One is product, and the other deals with placement. Quality affects brand preference, price, and share, but investments take time to be fully realized. We're not going to go into the detail on this because the literature is very vast and can get complicated. But one of the key findings is that quality is a major determinant of brand preference. That is, the higher the quality your product is, the larger your brand preference. Now, one study in particular was very interesting. It looked at changes in perceived brand preference versus whether a second brand in the category overcame the primary brand or the top share brand in that category. And in instances where a change in quality was highly perceived, up to 70% of the time, those two places changed place. So those two roles changed place. So the secondary brand became the primary brand in the category. That's how powerful quality can be. But we're going to look a little more detail on placement because this is an area where investing or executing at retail to expand and maintain shelf presence is a critical component for most brands. So one of the questions is, does brand out-of-stock situations occur? And the question is, does that lead to lost sales? Well, there was a very large meta-analysis done that showed that worldwide, out-of-stock within an individual retail can occur about 8.3% of the time. And in fact, this is pretty consistent across regions of the world. But what's more important is what happens when a consumer reaches an out-of-stock situation. What do they do? Do they not purchase the item at all? Do they delay their purchase? Do they buy the item at another retailer? Do they substitute within the same brand, for example, moving from one variety to another? Or do they substitute a different brand? The key thing is this one for substituting a different brand, where 26% of the time they will actually switch and choose a different brand. So that is a direct brand sale lost. And finally, we have two on price. One is that CPG products are generally quite price elastic, becoming more so over time. And so it's very important to manage the interplay between preference and price because that affects the level of market share. So if you can grow your preference, you have a choice. As a brand manager, you have a choice. You can take that growth in brand preference and translate it into a share gain, or you can translate it and actually raise your price and translate it into an increase in margin. So keep the same share, but increase the amount that you get per unit sold. And of course, there's a middle ground as well. So that becomes a very important aspect of that interplay, but doing a price change without the brand preference to support it is generally leads to a share loss. The other part is that price cuts, whether they be direct or through trade promotion, that are not supported by retailer advertising features or in-store displays, generate moderate to strong sales lift short-term, but weaken brand preference long-term as they train consumers to buy on discount. So the practical implication here is to reduce unsupported price discounts and shift funds to quality merchandising events. So let's look at some data. One point that should be made here is that as little as 1/3 of trade promotion sales comes from brand switching. The rest comes from stockpiling or category expansion. So in other words, if you use trade promotion, the sales that you're driving isn't necessarily coming from a competitor. That lowering a price could be coming from your own current buyers just buying more to take advantage of that offer and to stock up. So this makes retailer in-store support all the more important. And what are some things that you can, about retailer or feature support? Well, if you look at long-term sales response to trade promotion, you'll see that trade promotion that's supported by retail feature or display support is actually 10% more effective on average. but that when the retailer category management effects occur or a brand competitor does a price reaction. So for example, if the retailer doesn't pass the price on to consumers fully, that's the category management effect, or that the price is met by a competitor, you can see that actually you yield a much worse situation. So when doing trade promotion, it's absolutely critical to have the retailer and the brand working together. Okay. So the final statement here from Philip Kotler is that marketing is the science and art of exploring, creating, and delivering value to satisfy the needs of a target market at a profit. And all of these principles are focused on that idea, the idea of taking action at a brand and these key actions at the brand to grow higher and higher levels of preference and therefore higher and higher levels of sales. So this is the current BIB project team. We have our team leaders, our team heroes, and our staff, and we'd be very interested in finding anyone else who is interested in joining the team to continue to expand these principles and to create a set of literature which will help going into the future, help brand managers in the future consistently grow their brands. At this point, we'd be happy to open it up to any questions.
Frank, can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you fine.
Okay. First question. Do you think there is still room for adding in other principles besides the one presented today? The one presented today.
Yes, absolutely. So we presented 16 principles today in kind of a whirlwind overview. But we actually have 3 more currently being investigated by the team. And there's always the option of adding more. So the idea is to create a large literature that people can draw upon to, for whatever their brand situation is.
Next question. You alluded to brand preference, price and distribution interacting. How does that work?
Oh, yes, that's a great question. So it turns out that brand preference, besides working with price and distribution at the consumer level to actually grow larger share, it actually, there's an interaction outside of the consumer level. And with distribution, what happens is that the more preferred your brand is, the more likely it is that retailers will actually stock it. Retailers are incentivized to have the brands that people want on their shelves. And so they don't want to lose a sale to or have a shopper move to a competitor because they don't carry the brands that people want. So brand preference actually can drive distribution in those type of situations. On the other side on a price perspective, as we talked about a little bit earlier on, which is that there's interaction with this price and preference, where when you have a growth in preference, you can choose to take that as increased market share, or you can take that as increased margin. So that's really a brand's choice.
Next question. How category dependent are the principles? For example, can a brand from any category really find a compelling proposition?
Yes. We took great care when going over these principles and reviewing the literature to find principles that go across categories, so that they're very category agnostic. That doesn't mean that they don't that they aren't implemented within each category differently. For example, distribution, in a fast-moving consumer good would go through retailer partners, whereas distribution in, say, like the auto industry would go through increased dealerships. So there are different ways in which this interacts. As far as the proposition is concerned, one of the principles that we're currently reviewing goes directly to that, which is, can you find and how do you find a strong proposition within a category? So I can't really speak to the details of it yet. It's still undergoing review, but yes, propositions do. It does seem that within categories, there's always something good, to be saying about your brand that could draw from other brands.
Next question. Can we expand the measurement of GRP by including consumer data on time spent with branded content, specifically on digital where this metric is feasible?
Yes. In fact, one of the main parts that the team is currently looking at is the role of GRPs across different media vehicles. So GRPs in terms of digital, in terms of television, in terms of radio, coming up with the unified exposure rate. And then when you have that, that brand preference measure can act across them. So you can actually manage across channels using brand preference and combine the brand preference producing potential of your creative, regardless of platform, with the corresponding exposure rates. So that consumer metric of brand preference can in fact be incorporated with GRPs to understand and to project what your future sales trend will be. Next
question. Let's say your brand already has high market share and your business objective is more about increasing penetration versus market share. Is brand preference still the right metric to use to gauge business impact?
Oh, that's a very good question. And I'm actually going to put on my MSW.ARS hat for this one and talk about directly in the experience of the brand strength monitor. When we look at preference, you can actually look at preference among purchasers of the category, so people who are category involved, but you can also look at preference among non-involved consumers, or not consumers actually, non-involved individuals, so people who are not active in the category. And that tells you if you go down the path of doing a category growth strategy to bring more people into the category, it's very important to understand how those people coming in, if they will choose your brand over the competition. And so using brand preference, you're able to actually view that, which you can't view via any other way, via sales data, because those people actually aren't buying yet.
And we have 2 more questions that I'll read through. We are currently 2 minutes past the 2 o'clock hour, so I just want to make sure that we respect everybody's time. I'll go through these 2 questions. Any other questions that anybody may have, they can submit those to me at zina@thears.org, and I can make a connection between you and Frank. So Frank's next question, is market share for the product category, was this CPG? Does it hold for durable goods?
The categories that were involved in the trial were broad. We had categories where the average purchase item was 30 cents up to $30,000. So obviously those were in fast-moving consumer goods. So those were durable goods and other types of items. We also had categories which were spontaneous purchase versus deliberate purchase, and we had categories which were fragmented versus having only one, having 1 or 2 dominant players. So this whole paradigm actually goes across all the different types of categories, not just confined to CPG or to services, but in fact the full breadth of consumer categories.
And our final question, is there a minimum number of TRPs?
Yes, our studies actually focused on GRPs as a primary, but of course you could look at targeted rating points as well. It goes into that effective frequency. So if you're targeting a specific group with your media plan, you have to make sure that you have the proper number of frequencies and the proper media weight to take advantage of that brand preference producing potential of your advertising. So it very much works just the same way as GRPs, but among using the preference among the targeted group and using the exposure rate among that target group.
Okay, Frank, do you have any final thoughts that you'd like to share before we close?
No, I just want to thank everyone for attending.
Thank you. Everybody, thank you so much for attending our webcast today. And Frank, thank you, and MASB for taking the time to present your work to our webcast crowd. I hope everybody is able to join us for our annual conference in a couple of weeks. And I wish you all a great day. Thank you very much.